Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to this panel discussion as we discuss the inclusion of the African Union into the G20 and the different modalities that have to be considered by the African Union. With us, we have an excellent panel of experts. We have Dr. Ibrahim Mayaki, who will be joining us online. We have Dr. Chakrabarti, who will be joining us online, she's a senior fellow and deputy director at the Observer Research Foundation. We also have Dr. Monyae, who will be joining us shortly, and we have Dr. Akinola, who is here with us physically. We also have Elizabeth, who is joining us physically, and we also have Dr. Sarah Hamuda with us here physically. We welcome all to this panel discussion. We ask that you make it lively and as interactive as possible. The questions, make all the comments you need to make. We are here with an excellent, again, I repeat, excellent panel of experts who will be ready to answer, and we will have a vibrant discussion. And I will now give the floor to Elizabeth, who will give the welcome remarks, and then we will start with the panel discussion. Welcome, Elizabeth.
Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to this panel discussion on the eve of the BRICS Summit here in Johannesburg. And I think there are interesting linkages here that we can bring to the fore in discussing the G20, Africa, and indeed other informal groupings. Firstly, it's to thank the Development Reimagined for the opportunity to partner with you on this event and this topic. In the first instance, I think both you and Saya have been working and taking to heart what it means for the African Union to become a member of the G20. It's also great, we have a lot of similar interests, and I think we've shared platforms on various issues relevant to Africa's concerns and Africa's peace. So really great opportunity, and thank you very much for that. Secondly, let me also just say from my side a very big thank you to the other panelists that Ivory has already introduced, and say to our online audience, we've kept it small here at the Institute due to logistical challenges on campus, but really looking forward to engaging with people online. What I thought I would do sort of as a kickoff is really just make some remarks related to the topic. The Development Reimagined has produced a document which we'll put the link to in the chat, but a document that says why the G20 needs the African Union. What does an influential African Union in the G20 look like? We've also, I know that Dr. Mayaki has applied his mind and written on that recently, and we at SIA have also done some work in that regard. I think it was last month. But I thought that maybe I'll sort of just paint a context, picking on some of the issues and maybe posing some questions, and also bringing in the fact that South Africa is actually hosting the BRICS and what a forum like the BRICS can or can't do. And I thought I'd just make some remarks linked to the address that President Ramaphosa made yesterday on national TV, which was a foreign policy statement, and it was in advance of the BRICS summit, and he probably characterized the world in a way that we all understand, talking about it being an increasingly complex and fractured and increasingly polarized into competing camps, and that multilateralism, which is what the discussion also will have to focus on today is being replaced by the actions of different power blocks, all of which South Africa trades with, invests with, we use the technology of. So these are all important players for South Africa. And the president said that that was why South Africa continued to advocate for an open and rules-based international governance, trade and financial investment system, because that's the kind of system that from which we can best benefit, and certainly not from the exercise of power of unilateralism. So the discussion today is about the G20. At the core of it is how the G20, I would interpret it, how the G20 can galvanize and reinvigorate multilateralism. I think we all agree that the multilateralism through various formal multilateral institutions is either moving very, very slowly or is paralyzed. So how do we build consensus and efforts to our global challenges, of which multilateralism really holds the key? I think when I think of multilateralism, I also think often about multipolarity. And the Global South has also often spoken about the importance of a more multipolar world, a world where you don't have to, you're not driven and governed largely by one dominant power's sort of influence and power projection. But I think it's also true to say, and it's become increasingly apparent over the last few years, that multilateralism, that a more multipolar world doesn't necessarily mean multilateralism is going easier. In fact, it'll probably be a little bit more difficult because there are more powers that are able to project their particular perspectives and positions, and therefore it makes agreement much more difficult. You know, it's very easy when you've got, you know, one person dictating. It's a little bit more difficult when you have to aggregate to work with competing interests. So if we move really then very briefly to the G20, I mean, initially as a finance ministers meeting in the aftermath of the Asian financial crisis, then elevated to a summit meeting after the global financial crisis in 2008. And it's important to emphasize here that that particular crisis started from the global north, the US and then spreading to Europe. And at the time when it became that, it was trumpeted as the premier forum on global economic governance. And I would argue that at the time, I think it did a reasonably commendable job of tackling the immediate global financial challenges. And what we've seen over the years is, of course, the mandate has broadened. It's brought in, I think, very importantly, a significant development dimension, because it recognized that if we're going to get out of the global financial crisis, if we're going to look at inclusive growth requires us to also think about the countries that fall outside of the G20, and here I think that's the important point, and that we focus on development. But increasingly, I think we've also seen that when we talk about development, the financial intersect, the very origins of the G20 continue to remain critical to that. And that's where I actually also want to bring in the BRICS, because the BRICS is another sort of informal group. It's another club in the same way that the G7 is a club. And one of the things that the BRICS has been doing is really positioning itself as a vehicle for global governance reforms. It's probably easier said than done, because we all know that we all can agree that global governance needs to reform. The devil is always in the detail, and when you sit down to decide on how exactly you wish to reform it, you recognize that maybe we still have some way to arrive at consensus. But I think these platforms are for trying to build consensus and develop and build some coordination going forward. And so in that sense, the fact that the BRICS summit is happening this week, we'll have the largest number of countries participating. We have a number of countries that have applied to join. I think it highlights for us the fact that I think the Global South in particular is looking for platforms which it can really drive meaningful reform and put it in a big way on the table. Because I think we can all agree that while there's been a lot of talk about global governance reform in recent years, sort of putting down the, sort of the concrete processes has been a little lacking. So I want to then move just very quickly to just a couple of questions around the AU and then pass it back on to Ivory. I've probably exceeded my mandate already. And the point here is that I think, the issue of bringing the AU into the G20 is not a new discussion. It has certainly received a lot of impetus, I think, particularly Sal last year. Was it last year? And what I think has been very, very positive, and I'm sure we'll also hear from my colleague at ORF, is that India and Prime Minister Modi has taken this forward. Letters to all the G20 leaders in that regard to bring the AU into the G20. I think some of the issues that we will have to consider if the AU were to join the G20 is the AU, after all, is an intergovernmental organization. It's not like the EU. It's not a supranational body. How do we arrive at common positions? How do we identify the important priorities that require us to have common positions at the G20? How do we ensure continuity of representation so that it's not the chair every year that changes, because you really need to be able to build up capacity and also the personal engagement was as important. And lastly, how do we ensure we have backup, we have resources, we set up the platforms that enable participation to be meaningful in terms of expertise and so on. And lastly, how do we ensure, and part of the points I've raised already are linked to that. One of the key challenges, or one of the key things that one does in these informal groupings, is you don't go in there and try to operate on your own. You try to build up coalitions and partnerships on particular issues where you have agreement. And that, I think, will be really critical. And we can do that both within the G20 and in other informal groupings and for example, such as the BRICS. So these are just some points which I wanted to sort of put out there at the outset, and then I'm really looking forward to the inputs of the panel and certainly to learn and hopefully to come out of this with something more concrete also in terms of what we as think tanks and knowledge institutions can also contribute towards. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Elizabeth. I think we can all agree that that was a very powerful introduction from reminding us that the AU has to think about its priorities. It has to think about continuous representation. We have to think about the devil in the details. As Elizabeth reminds us, it is how are things going to be done? How are things going to be implemented? And overall, the African Union wants representation in multilateralism. And so with that, we'll just kick off with a discussion, and we'll start with Dr. Ibrahim Mayaki, who will be joining us virtually. And the first question for him, as having been with the African Union, is that, drawing from your experiences, Dr. Mayaki, how, one, would the G20 benefit with the AU being a permanent member, and vice versa? How would the AU benefit?
Thank you very much, and warm greetings to you all and to Elizabeth, and thanks to Development Reimagined. Before answering to your question, I would like to point a global context issue, and the global context currently, as seen from an African perspective, from the interactions that I have with several countries, heads of states, heads of governments, and the African Union Commission, is that the positions that the African Union is likely to take in a very disrupted world context need to be very well thought about. We were used to a less complicated context where, and when I say less complicated, I'm talking about the world before the Ukraine war, because the Ukraine war was a very particular point. The world before the Ukraine war was less complicated than it is today, because you had a clear sense. When I say we, I'm talking from the African side. We had a clear sense of the positions and interests of the other actors we were dealing with. In the North, in the European Union, the United States of America, etc., and in the South with India, China, Brazil, which are all members of the BRICS, and the other countries like Indonesia. We had a sense of what their positions were and what their interests were. In the current context, we do not exactly have that confidence in the knowledge of their positions and their interests. So that's my first point. But the second point is about the global common position that have come out of a multilateral context, like the SDGs. When you travel throughout the continent and you talk to finance ministers, environment ministers, planning ministers, they tell you, and I'm going to be very frank and direct, but their commitment to the SDGs is no longer, well, let me be diplomatic. Their commitment to the SDGs is weak. And they don't believe sincerely in an implementation of the SDGs as planned, because we know what the financing gaps are, and we know that very practically and pragmatically, these gaps cannot be filled. That's the second point on the global context. The third point is within Africa itself, there are two questions that are being put on the table and which are very important in my view. The first one is about our governance systems, internal governance systems. Many African elites and many African populations, and we can see through Afrobarometer indicators and so on, have strong questions about what we mean by democracy and how effective and efficient it is. And I'll come back to that because I think it's important. And the second point is that we see a return of ideology in most of the regions in which we are. The SADC region, the Central African region, the East African region, the Northern region. There is a return of ideology. We're not saying that it is ideology, but you can see the signs that there is a new type, a reborn of ideological thinking. And the questioning of democratic systems and the questioning and the return of ideology makes the definition of common African positions a little bit more difficult than before the Ukraine war. That said, when I accompanied Prime Minister Meles Zenawi to the G20 meetings he was attending as CEO of NEPAD, and he was the chair of the NEPAD Heads of States and Government Committee, I remember that the discussions were taking place as I was accompanying him to a Heads of States meeting, were 1/3 political and 2/3 technical. What do I mean by 1/3 political? 1/3 political because they had to the one-third, the content of the one-third was mainly about the increasing role that Africa could play in some critical discussions at the global level. And the two-thirds of the technical were about increasing investment in infrastructure, in agriculture, in climate finance, etc., in climate adaptation, and so on. Today, I think that proportion will be reversed. It will be two-thirds political, one-third technical. Why two-thirds political? Because we know that the possibilities of reforming the global financial architecture, the possibilities of attracting foreign investment in Africa can be discussed and are not really, for example, in infrastructure or in climate, are quite difficult to be diplomatic. And so technically, once the African Union is part of the G20, and it will be part of the G20 with a permanent seat, the discussions that Africa will bring and the common positions that will be framed will have a heavy political weight and a little technical weight. And by technical, I'm sorry, my English is not perfect as I'm French speaking, but by technical, I mean the issues related to, the classical issues, how to attract investment in infrastructure, agriculture, and so on. So my final point is, in the design of this common position of the African Union on political issues, with a return of ideology, we need to be prepared, the African Union Commission and all the other states, to engage the African Union in a deeper political thinking about the role of Africa on the global scene. It means that the reform of the African Union, we started with President Kagame's 2016 proposals, will need to be increased to another level of thinking. And this is what can allow an African Union to be really present in the G20 and to trigger critical discussions that can benefit Africa's interest on the basis of the way Africa sees the world today. And this is why we wrote this article in Project Syndicate with Dauda Semben, to illustrate the fact that we cannot go to a G20 in a just walking along usual path. We need to engage in a deep internal political thinking, taking into account the issues that I mentioned before. I thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Mayaki. I think we can all agree with his sentiments, and I like what he has just said. And he has said with certainty that and the AU will be part of the G20. I think we can all agree that we love that statement. But now we'll cross over to Dr. Malancha of ORF. She's also joining us online. And just building up on what Dr. Mayaki has said on disruption needs planning, on that we need to design a common position as Africa. My question, or rather our question to you is, since you are based in India and you have worked very closely with the G20, the question is, what lessons should the African Union learn from India's engagement with the G20, given that disruption needs planning?
Thank you so much. It's such a pleasure to be a part of such a good panel. Let me just start by saying that, for India, Africa's development is central to its own foreign policy goals and is into the world becoming truly multipolar. So India truly believes that African Union should have a permanent seat at the G20, and India has used its presidency effectively towards that end. And I also agree with Dr. Mayaki that African Union will be and should be a part of the G20. Now, I think there are two things that really need to be highlighted, that India's engagement at the G20 has focused on development and not allowing any other issue, particularly the Ukraine-Russia issue, to only dominate. You know, we've time and again, India's Sherpa Amitabh Kant has reiterated, India has, through its presidency, tried to put the emphasis back on development concerns of the global south. So I think that is one of the most important takeaways, that the times that we are living in, development is the critical concern, which needs the maximum attention. And that should be the first lesson. The second lesson, or I'm not sure if I should call it the second lesson, but I will just try to explain it through my understanding of recent history about Africa's actual engagement at the G20 so far. So the first reference to Africa in G20 was made in 2010. And so it is just about a 13-year-old, very recent history, when financial support through concessional lending to African Development Bank was promised at the Toronto Summit. Now, thereafter, the discussion has focused on infrastructure building, regional economic integration through trade facilitation during the Seoul Summit, and African countries have slowly been invited to G20 summits. So the biggest initiative came from Germany in 2017, which the compact with Africa, which literally aimed on promoting investments in reform-friendly countries. So if we try and analyze this journey to now, when we are talking about a permanent seat for African Union, so up till now, the narrative was more focused on what the G20 can do for Africa. And now that we're discussing and hoping for a permanent seat, I think there is a need to completely alter this narrative. What needs to be the focus now should be, what can Africa's contribution to the global problems? Africa is not the problem that the G20 needs to solve, or anybody needs to solve. The real problems that the world is facing at this point of time are climate change, extreme food insecurity. Yes, conflict is playing a huge role in that. So these are the issues that the world needs to think about, and Africa needs to contribute effectively to these discussions. So I think that should be the greatest contribution that African Union should make when it joins the G20.
Thank you very much, Dr. Malancha. Again, I really this discussion, and I'm sure everyone in the room is enjoying it. Just to what she has said is that Africa is not a problem that the G20 needs to solve, but that Africa needs to be part of the discussions in order to provide solutions. And she's just talked about Africa's engagement with the G20 mostly being focused on development. And so I think that gives us a perfect segue to move on to Dr. Akinola, who is here with us physically. And so the question is then, who should represent the African Union in the finance ministers and central bank governors meetings, given that the African Union does not have a continental bank?
Thank you so much. And when I heard this question, I was tempted to say I should. I should represent the African Union at that level. Well, I am very hopeful. Maybe I should put that very clearly, that African Union will soon have a very vibrant continental bank. as African leaders, continental leaders are beginning to rethink the place of the African Union, particularly as an effective African agency, or maybe I should say African developmental agency. The African Union will fare better with a continental bank. Let me say that first. But for now, since the African Union do not have, that can be an excuse to actually deny them of membership. So what I think should happen is that first, the AU can use the facility of the AFDB, for instance, the African Development Bank Group, and other economically functional RECs, such as ECOWAS, such as SADC. We also have COMESA, and specifically, for instance, the African Union can draw from experts, draw from specifically ECOWAS Bank for Investments and Development. We also have other representatives from other regions, such as the Trade and Development Bank, the Committee of Central Bank Governors in SADC. We call them the CCBC. They can draw experts from those regions. And we have to also look within the African Union itself. And I know they have the African Union Commissioner for Economic Affairs. The AU has this commissioner already in their role, and they can also rely on his expertise and draw a team from this agency within. Apart from that, you can also draw from finance ministers of national member states, the African Union. We can also draw from the central bank governance of member states of the African Union. Apart from that, also, we can also, when I say we are talking about the AU can also draw from the maybe African economic teams in many of the global or maybe multilateral financial system across the world. There are many of them in the IMF, there are many of them in the World Bank. Even you can even sidetrack and use some of those people in the WTO. So Africans can draw from all this pool of capable experts of Africa, indigenous population to actually make up this team. Despite the fact that the AU doesn't have a central bank, by leveraging on these important outlets, I think the AU interest in finance and monetary or financial central banking should be adequately protected. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Akinola. I think we all agree that you should represent you should represent the African Union in these meetings. So now we remember that Dr. Mayaki spoke about the SDGs, and he's put it very diplomatically, and he said that there's weak commitment. So now we want to move on to Sarah Hamuda, who is with the APRM, and she's the perfect person to ask this question and to have this conversation with. We're moving closer towards G20 membership. We have the G20 action plan on SDGs. Maybe you can tell us what the APRM is doing to help African states implement and move closer towards the action plan.
Okay, thank you very much, Ivori Cairo. I'm not sure if I am the perfect person for that, but thank you, moderator. And it's a great pleasure to be in this panel with distinguished panelists. Of course, Dr. Mayaki is our, I would say, godfather. And I remember that he approved that I can conduct interviews for my master's degree because from his own staff when he was chairing, when he was the CEO of Audanipad. I just want to tell you, Prof, that I passed and I'm now a PhD candidate. So thank you for supporting me. We never had a chance to meet physically, although we are in the same building. So I think this conversation is really timely needed, not only because South Africa, as Elizabeth highlighted, that proudly hosting the BRICS, but also with the current momentum taking place in the continent, as Dr. Mayaki perfectly alluded, the global changes in the multilateral system. And on the other side, also we at the African Union now, we are preparing for the second 10-year implementation plan of Agenda 2063, and we are finalizing the evaluation of the first 10-year implementation of Agenda 2063 with some achievements and of course different shortcomings. Let me also link with how we can use G20 to highlight African priorities and voice in the world, and this in alignment with Aspiration 7 of Agenda 2063 and Africa with a strong and unified global voice. And also taking into consideration that Uganda is starting from January 2024, will be also chairing the non-alignment movement. So there is a huge momentum that we can build on to allow Africa through different groupings to highlight and to allude to a more fair and multilateral global system. Speaking about very briefly, we are part of the African Union, and we are a voluntary exit mechanism. We are responsibly in charge of conducting governance assessment reviews, talking about political governance, economic governance, socioeconomic development on the continent. And then since 2017 on the institutional reforms led by President Kagame, as Dr. Mayaki highlighted, we have been given expanded mandate to support member states in the reporting and evaluation of Agenda 2063 and Agenda 2030. But let me highlight here that this is quite a broad mandate, and we have been decided as EPRM to remain focused on good governance promotion, particularly aspiration 3 and 4. But given the fact that also governance is a quite catch-up-all definition and is a broad, I would say, objective, we are also supporting member states in different aspects, especially the voluntary national reporting on SDGs and Agenda 2063. So just last month, during the high-level political forum in New York, this is probably the global institutional mechanism where member states submit voluntarily how far they are in the SDGs and Agenda 2063. We noted that by 2023, we have 53 African countries reported at least once on SDGs progress. This number of these countries, maybe 35, have been committed to report on Agenda 2063. And of course, you can notice from the difference that there's a lack of awareness on Agenda 2063. Also, we noted from our evidence-based research. In the high-level political forum, member states also explicitly the struggles they have when it comes to environmental vulnerabilities. This was echoed by our colleague from India. Of course, the common issue of resource mobilization and engagement of youth and gender in the national planning issues, and also how this should require further continental and multilateral support. We have been quite active to support member states in different principles endorsed by G20. Actually, the work referring to disaster management and planning has been quite emphasized after COVID-19. So we have a specific community of practice on national planning. And actually, we are expecting next month, hopefully, to organize the annual meeting. We are trying to be also regionally moved on the continent. And we have developed an African index, Africa Governance Index, I would say quite similar to Mo Ibrahim, but it aims to literally use the national data to generate information about the governance trends in Africa. And we have established a disaster a component on resilience and disaster management under this framework to see how far member states are able to also develop resilient policies. What we noted from interactions, Madam Moderator, if I'm allowed to still give some reflections, is actually the issue on effective fiscal and debt management in Africa, and also the capacity, as I said, to mobilize resources, but also building institutions. Let's not ignore that we have a continent with some post-fragile and fragile state and post-conflict situation, and some countries need support like Sudan. And there's always challenges to mobilize resources for these countries. Another area of support to try to engage with the UN and even UNECA, the Economic Commission for Africa, is the issue of creditworthiness and the right of African member states to also have their own credit rating agencies, especially with the unjustifiable downgrading of many African countries, creditworthiness during the COVID-19 crisis. This is quite imperative currently for the current debate towards a new international financial architecture. What we also noticed, and surprisingly, despite the financial problems that African countries have, is that there is a new voice about the need to reduce reliance on donor ODA or donor countries assistance, and transforming this to technical assistance and knowledge sharing programs as favored by African countries. Investment in green economy and climate resilience and also sustainable food systems are emphasized. Lastly, but not least, also as a part of our support, because we serve as a, I would say, catalytical institution for South-South cooperation. I would say that Uganda started supporting us intensively, and South Africa on the role of EPRM in the South, in the global South. And I think this all started in Buenos Aires in 2019 when we participated in the Papa Plus 40, the Buenos Aires Plan anniversary, the 40th anniversary. How far countries from the global South have been also advancing to promote South-South cooperation. And we, there were many voices at that time saying that EPRM should have an African high-level forum on South-South cooperation and triangular cooperation to voice out all these partnerships, the EU partnership, the EU Brazil, the EU China platforms. And we established the South-South Cooperation High-Level Forum in partnership with the United Nations and the different IFIs, I would say, the Islamic Development Bank, ABC Brazil, and also in the RIS and the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, they also took part in this forum. The second edition of this forum was held in Kampala last January. And the outcome document or the declaration of the forum was endorsed by the EPRM highest level at the summit of presidents. And it brought more than 200 experts, and we focused on creating the I would say, New South. And also we addressed different issues related to the implementation of Papa Plus 40 in Africa, the institutional mechanisms existing on the continent to promote South-South cooperation. And unfortunately, we realized that we still have a long way ahead to enhance this because we have literally 4 or 5 development agencies across the continent. We also addressed the role of academia and civil society in creating this global South solidarity. And I would say that some of the key initiatives emanated from this forum is to have the national planning community practice to support countries in policy coherence for sustainable development. And we already started very good initiative with the OECD to support 5 African countries, including Ghana, Namibia, Kenya, South Africa, Sierra Leone, on conducting assessment on policy coherence for sustainable development. We just concluded with Ghana in May, and actually in October, we are expecting capacity building for Namibia and South Africa on this regard. And lastly, but not least, we are trying to develop currently virtual South-South cooperation and I would say training capacity program for member states, but also we will try to keep it open for everybody, especially for the academia. And we will do this in partnership with the Islamic Development Bank and the Tunisian Agency for Partnership for Development. But of course, we are welcoming SAIA to be part of this network as well. So thank you very much, and thank you for allowing me to be part of this panel.
Thank you very much, Sarah. Thank you very much for your insights. And now we know what APRM is doing. And I think we can all agree that the aspects of what they're doing that can really help Africa and the AU as they join the G20. Now we'll go back virtually to Dr. Mayaki. And the next questions are more or less on preparation. And seeing as Dr. Mayaki, you recently Dauda, and you've been at the AU. The question is, how should the AU prepare before joining the G20? Are there things that the AU needs to put in place before actually becoming a permanent member of the G20?
Thank you for the question. I think there are four critical points which are important. The first one is to really determine who will represent the African Union within the G20 with 2 criteria, a criteria of regularity and continuity, so that the common positions that are defined and enhanced by the representative can have an impact. So there are several proposals that can be made, but the filtering criteria need to be regularity, continuity, based evidently on competence, but this has to be taken for given, because otherwise it wouldn't make sense. So that could be, as we said in the article we wrote, the chairperson of a commission or a former head of states who was the sufficient bagage to carry on these duties. But regularity, continuity based on competence, with evidently a group of experts supporting this representation. That's point number one. Point number two, I'm going to refer again to the next stage of reforms that the African Union needs to undertake. The African Union Commission does not have a chief economist. Almost none of the regional economic communities have a chief economist, and dedicated teams of economists reflecting on economic issues. Whether it is the finance track or the Sherpa track, the issues of finance and economics are extremely important within the G20 discussions. So this has to be organized. And I'm very hopeful that the African Union Commission will take the necessary steps in order to organize particularly this dimension. The third point is the reference I was making to the political, ideological dimension of the subjects that will arise in the years to come. We know almost with quasi-certainty that ODA will disappear as it is. Development cooperation and ODA are being extremely geopoliticized. So the ODA as we know it, donors' behavior as we know it, will disappear. It will be something else, which I can't put a name on it, but it will be something else. But we know that ODA will disappear. I'm from the Sahel region, and I can give you a very concrete example. ODA is equal to military support, nothing else. It doesn't come into health, education, or etc. I mean, the facts are there and the numbers are there. So with the fact that ODA disappears and the role of donors do change, Africa will need to ask itself questions, which are mainly political, on how does it best mobilize its domestic resources. Another fact, if you put together all the assets under management of African pension funds and African sovereign wealth funds, you have a total of assets under management which is close to $1 trillion. These are also facts. I mean, you check at the African Development Bank numbers and you find the facts. And where do these funds, pension funds and sovereign wealth funds, where do they invest? They invest outside of the continent. They need to invest more in the continent. But these investment funds evidently need to take care of their pensioners, etc. But they need to be looked at in a political dimension, so that even in terms of efficiency, there is a redirection of the resources towards the development of a continent. And we know, I don't have time to go into the details, We know that the projects do exist and the returns of investments in Africa are higher than in other regions of the world. This is not an economic, technical question. All what is technical has already been looked at. It's a political issue. So that political discussion will need to take place. And as we go into the G20, we shouldn't go to a G20, the African Union, as beggars, as we do when we go to the COP, the different COP. We tend to go as beggars. Africa needs to be assisted. Africa needs investments, but we are not doing our own homework. So a behavior of begging has to be prohibited, quote and unquote. And I think this is a very important point in order for African elites to regain credibility vis-a-vis their populations. And I'm sliding in and over territory, but I wanted to say it so that it is clear. So when you put all these points together, the presence of the African Union in the G20 will not be a sinecure. It will be hard work, clear positions, and soundly worked upon solutions. And this is what will make Africa credible. Once we go in the G20, we have to get in the G20 with credibility, knowing exactly what we want and defining exactly what our interests are vis-a-vis the North and vis-a-vis the Global South. Because the long term here is extremely important. The long term is extremely important. Africa needs a long-term vision. Agenda 2063 is fine, but it has to be reviewed. And as the colleague from APRM was saying, it's not only the review of the next 10 years, it's the review of a long-term process. We need a new Agenda 2063, looking at more concrete things inside, given the context in which we are. So credibility will be the name of the game when we sit at the table. Thank you.
Very much, Dr. Mayaki. Those were very interesting insights. I think we can all agree. One, Africa must not go to the table as beggars. Africa must define its interests. Africa must have the political discussion, whether we like it or not. We must ask the political questions, and we have to be clear about our positions. So still in the same vein of preparations, we'll move to Dr. Malantra, and we'll hear from her. How does India prepare for the G20, and what lessons can the African Union learn? Because India is already a member of the G20, so we need to understand how exactly does it prepare, and what lessons can Africa draw from its preparation.
That's an interesting question, but also a tough, because India is a country, and the way it formulates its positions on various issues, structurally, the AU will be very different from a country representing G20. So, which makes your question rather difficult to answer. But then, if there are some lessons or some inspiration that can be taken from India, India's positions on various issues are formulated by close consultations with various ministries. So you already have the Ministry of Agriculture, Ministry of Finance, Ministry of Environment and Forest, continuously working on all these global issues of climate change, food, agriculture, etc. So all that work then feeds in to form the positions. So a lot of, and these ministries in turn then consult with experts, civil society organizations. So there is wider consultation, between ministries and even outside the ministries. So a lot of expert advice comes from within the ministries, from experts who are working in think tanks like ours, and the Niti Aayog, which again is a different kind of institution. So I'm not sure if parallels can be drawn from that, but what the main point would be that a lot of effort or research or knowledge comes from the academia and think tanks, experts, and ministries who are working on these issues on a regular basis. So that contribution then feeds in to the process and helps the officials form their positions or their decisions.
Thank you very much, Dr. Malantra. So from there, we'll move to Dr. Akinola, and we want to know when the African Union joins the G20, how should the AU implement decisions from the G20?
Thank you. We have to first note that no international organization, I mean loose international organization, is a member. So the only experience that we can draw from, that the African Union can draw from, is from a supranational organization with different working modalities with the African Union. But despite that fact, there are still things that African Union can learn from the European Union. And what they can do is to engage with the EU and try to learn by doing. Not just learning by disengaging, you learn and you begin to do. But they have to have a deep understanding and reflection of what is practicable within the context of Africa's reality, so that they don't begin to just copy and paste. But specifically, let me focus on 9 points, and I won't really waste time. Sorry, 7 points that I will just quickly mention. I know when I said 9, you are like, ish. So the first one is to prioritize relevant policies. The AU members should highlight. The first thing for you to do is to identify, highlight, and prioritize policies that are directly aligned with the developmental goals of the African Union. We can borrow from Agenda 2063, but we also know that the developmental template is not exhaustive enough. We need to also widen the base of even the Agenda 2063. We've got to reflect on issues around climate change, infrastructural development, depleting education system, and all of that, particularly peace and security. The second point we also have to think through is on local adaptation and what I can call domestication of policies. Government must adapt G20 policies to fit their local context and need. You also understand that African Union is not a country. So despite the fact that they can act as an agency for almost 50-something African countries, about 53 African countries, the onus lies on those member states to be able to actually adapt the policies of G20. But the African Union must lead in this. They must also try to do capacity building and expansion governance architecture. And one of the presenters at our IPRM actually spoke to this, so I don't need to explain this. One thing we also have to do is partnerships. I'm not even talking about local partnerships. I'm still talking about collaboration with international organizations, development partners, not just state partners. We also have to partner with non-state foreign actors that are experienced in whatever Africa is dealing with. We also need to leverage this partnership to be able to mobilize African resources the best practices, and maybe one way or the other, we should be able to also gain technical expertise for African Union to be able to stand on their own as they begin to go within this and operate within this organization. One thing they must also try to do is public awareness and partnership with think tank community, academia, CSOs. One thing we have known about the AU, and one of the criticism has been the disengagement between the union and mass of Africans who tell you they are not aware. Some of the this should not be the case. They should put, I don't know, maybe through APRM, peer review, something they have to monitor and evaluate so that they can establish mechanism to monitor progress. They shouldn't just wait for 10 years. I know Africa, we are used to waiting for 10 years before we review. Within 10 years, things could have gotten so bad. So it's something they have to do intermittently. Then we should try whatever they are trying to implement should not also completely distort and dislodge the moderate achievement towards regionalism in Africa, particularly the free trade regime that Africa is trying to build. Thank you.
I just wanted to add a couple of points to the discussion that's been had so far. The first really relates to the point I think that Dr. Malangcha spoke about, and you've also spoken about it, which is really the importance of using knowledge institutions on the continent that are thinking about the big global issues and that are making input and recommendations that can feed into the development of common African positions on global governance issues. And we at the Institute, and we were talking about this a little earlier, Ivory, we at the Institute a few years ago began an informal network bringing together a number of African think tanks that look at some of the global issues or some of the bigger economic issues to start engaging, even though their countries were perhaps not members of the G20, to begin engaging on the G20. And at the last Think 20 summit now in India, in Mysore earlier this week, this month, we sort of reconvened and had a few institutions from across the continent. I think there is something we can build on there. And Dr. Mayaki's initiative before he left Outer NEPAD, which was developing a policy bridge tank, we think is a really important vehicle actually for bringing African knowledge institutions or think tanks in the first instance together with policymakers. But clearly there are also knowledge institutions like the Economic Commission for Africa and of course the African Development Bank that can be used. The second point I want to make is that of course at one of the most important objectives, elements of the G20 is about how the global economic governance system should be reformed. And I think the points that Dr. Mayaki has made in terms of understanding the global context are very important and how that affects our own domestic decisions. But so that's one dimension. The other dimension in terms of how we implement decisions is that when that come out of the G20 is that we need to be clear about what kind of reform, when we're talking about the World Bank's roadmap, what kinds of reforms in the multilateral development universe are important for Africa, and how do we drive them in the G20, and then how do we make sure, again through coalitions and partnerships, that we drive it at the World Bank and the IMF. Just to give you a very interesting example, the discussions around the global tax issues, which again, there was consensus that was built within the G20 and then was taken to the Inclusive Forum in Paris. I think a much stronger African push there on certain aspects of it, which in effect we know when you talk about the minimum tax and which sectors were included and which weren't, benefited more the global north, which is why they were quite happy to push for the reforms. But I think the example of Kenya was that if they were to implement the digital tax, out of the 89 companies that they tax now, they would only be taxing 11. I mean, that kind of thing tells you how critical it is to actually have to have the stats, to have the analysis, and to be able then to push to see how it impacts on us, and then to push for those in the G20 and then push for those and build consensus, at least on some issues in the G20, that we can then take to forums like the Inclusive Forum, or whether it's the World Bank or whatever. And that's critical. And that, I think, is where the technical elements become so important. The point that Dr. Mayaki made about building up expertise and using it. And then, of course, the political dimensions of actually being able to drive it and building consensus. The thing is that as an intergovernmental, we're not going to be able to build consensus on everything on the continent. But there are, I would, 3 or 4 key elements. I mean, you mentioned credit rating agencies. The debt is another one. Reform of the MDBs, where we probably can agree on a number of issues that we can push very forcefully. I think we also have to be sort of, recognize that we can't do everything, but that, and certainly in the short term, what are the issues that we want to push?
Before we move on to the next speaker, we'll just still focus on Elizabeth, and you've talked about decision implementation and collaboration, but the one question we definitely want to ask, that South Africa is a member of the G20 and BRICS is happening from tomorrow, and we are in South Africa for BRICS as well. How then, when the AU joins the G20, in what areas then can the AU collaborate with South Africa?
Well, of course, in the first instance, South Africa is a member of the AU. And I would say, I would see it, and in many respects, unlike I think most other countries in the G20, South Africa has always tried to and articulated it that way, that we are there as South Africa. We don't represent the continent, but we try to bring onto the agenda issues that are important to the continent. And I would think that certainly initially, South Africa could work closely with the AU. In terms of building up a lot of the issues that we've spoken about. So almost a kind of a friend of the AU, but a member of the AU as well. I think it will certainly on a number of issues where South Africa has been strong and has been quite vocal in the G20, one of which is, for example, the illicit financial flows. And that's been a very important element that we've tried to carry through, particularly through the development working group, where South Africa has always, been a co-chair. Those are issues with the membership of the AU, where we can really sort of create a caucus or a kernel that really can drive that forward. There are obviously there may very well be differences on particular issues between South Africa and the AU, and that's fine. But the AU, it is critical for the AU to be able to identify a sort of a number of priority issues that it seeks to then build consensus around within the G20. But it can only do that with all the kinds of points that Dr. Mayaki has highlighted as being critical. Even in in the context of the you talk about the BRICS. I mean, South Africa has interdepartmental sort of I don't know what they call it, group at government level on the BRICS. I think going forward, particularly as we move into prepare for our chairmanship of the G20 in 2025, we probably should be thinking about creating a G20 secretariat almost in South Africa, just to drive, to be able to carry forward our priorities that we want to bring to our presidency of the G20. And those are the kinds of mechanisms that different countries and the AU obviously would have to look at.
Okay, thank you very much. The last question is for Dr. Sarah before the final round of questions, and it will be the same for all the panelists, and it's basically the EU and EU's relationship and interaction with the G20. But before we go to that question, Dr. Sarah, we want to know what are the potential challenges or gaps in the Agenda 2063 or the SDGs that then when the AU joins the G20 will be addressed.
Also reflecting on what Elizabeth was referring to, the key priorities that we should build on or present to G20. And I think also it's a concern of most of African countries. If you look at the Global Sustainable Development Report, we have more than half of the continent with almost 20%, 30% of data on the SDGs indicators. We have noticed the same problem with Agenda 2063, even though if Agenda 2063 have only 66 indicators according to the continental framework, reporting framework. And I want to say here, because my colleague, the doctor was talking about the importance of reporting alongside the review, that there is a progress report on Agenda 2063 every 2 years, but unfortunately, 10-year implementation plan, we only produced 2. And the 2 reports were led by the African Commission and AUDA-NIPAD. They are responsible for the overall reporting, and EPRM is helping with the governance component. There is also the Africa Governance Report that EPRM is also producing every 2 years. And this year, the theme was the unconstitutional change of government in Africa. And once again, it's resonating to what Professor Mayaki was talking about. And by the way, this one of the recommendations of the UCG report that we need to focus on the states and relationships and the issue of social contract. I'm a political science student in origin. I believe we are lacking in most of our debates and most of our conversations, the social contract between African countries and their own citizens, and how we should strengthen this contract with providing citizens with basic services. So moving from that point to the challenges, of course, it's already mentioned, the challenges are already mentioned as priorities in the second 10-year implementation plan. There is a focus on infrastructure, focus on food security, digitalization, education, good governance, by the way. And here, I want to say that it's very important while we are trying to reprioritize, speaking about peace and security, it's also very important to not undermine governance and building institutions. I'm afraid that all the debate now is and the focus of even donors funding on peace and security, given the rise of coups in the last 10 years in Africa, or the challenges that many member states are facing. But if you don't build the institutions and support civil service, you will not be able to sustain peace. It's a very humble intake on that. And I don't want to mention that, but we visited Khartoum in 2020. It was the first country we were requested to support at that time the transition government with the priorities and to do governance gap analysis. And we visited one of the institutions and it was completely empty. You can feel from the entrance that the civil servants were not working there for a long time. That's what the EPRM is trying to do with this engagement with member states, supporting CSOs, non-state actors, because we don't have offices as African Union. We're not like the UNDP. So this is one of the also challenge we hear from member states, that we are not engaging continuously, systematically, similar to the UNDP or other organizations. So we need to take this all these elements into consideration while we are trying to focus on the African Union vision for development and priorities. The last point, In addition to what Dr. Mikey says about regularity, but alignment, if Africa is becoming a member of G20, we need to ask ourselves how this make difference from the priorities we're discussing in the non-alignment movement or within the EU partnership with key priorities over the partnership we have with the European Union. So it's very important to also ask ourselves how we align the African priorities and submitting this position in a coherent way. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sarah. So just to ensure the discussion is not boring, or for anyone who is feeling bored, we'll move to the questions. There are 2 questions online. So we'll move to those questions before we take the final round of discussion with the panelists, and then we can move to the questions that anyone in the room has. So the first question by Victor is, what is the role of Africa with regards to the G20 and BRICS? And he says the point is this: how does Africa define its role in these organizations? And I think Elizabeth can answer this question.
Well, I think on the G20, it's maybe a little easier in the sense that the G20 brings together systemically important countries from both the global north and the global south to really fundamentally, in the first instance, look at, it's about global governance and whether we're, it does a whole range of other things as well. For example, it brings out a development review every couple of years that looks at how each of the member states have advanced on the SDGs, etc. But, it's also fundamentally about looking at the global financial regulatory system, financing more broadly on climate and so on. And so there, Africa, the decisions are often taken there, and which are then driven through other processes, have a significant impact on Africa. Just to give you one example, very soon after the global financial crisis, also in the context of sort of trying to curb terrorism and all of that, it's part of that broader chapeau of financing issues. Some of the decisions were taken, and also about ensuring that that banks were solid and whatever. Certain decisions were taken around correspondent banking, which so South Africa is always in a slightly different place around financing and banking, but on some of those decisions there would be significant consequences for African countries and African financial banking system. Now, if you're in the G20 and you're very much part of those conversations, and what the problems are going to be because you understand your particular context, being in the G20 and having a voice and being there permanently is the importance is quite clear. BRICS is a slightly different sort of grouping in the sense that it's now made up of global South countries. The idea really is to augment that if the decision, well, I think the decision will be taken to expand. It'll be interesting to see what kind of criteria emerge from it. And as the president said it very clearly yesterday, but even if you go back to a lot of the discussions when the BRIC were established in 2009, it was also not just about cooperation among those countries, but it was also about really pushing for global governance reforms on particular areas that these countries felt they were being, disadvantaged, or they didn't have the, didn't work in their favor, the rules didn't work in their favor. In that sense, also, being able to participate in those discussions in that forum, which can be a kind of mini forum that drives certain things forward, can also be advantageous. But I do have to say that, the global South over the last 20 years has become fragmented in the sense that, you have very big, very powerful economies, and you still have very small and marginal economies. And so our interests, by definition, are very different. The economic interests of China are going to be very different from the economic interests of an Eswatini or even of a South Africa. And so we also need to recognize that while we all have one objective of moving forward on global governance reforms, and some of these groupings can advance that, we still need to be very clear. And again, I think we're emphasizing what Dr. Mayaki said. We need to be very clear about our interests and our priorities. And we need to go in there pushing those, not sort of responding, not being reactive, but being proactive on what we want to put on the table and what exactly we want to get out of it.
Thank you very much. Victor, I do believe your question has been sufficiently answered by Elizabeth. The next question is for Dr. Akinola, and this is by Grace. And she's saying, with the AU being plagued by what seems to be the lack of unity when it comes to the execution of plans, the AU joining the G20 seems like a very good move, but it will truly help if the AU has internal review processes. So she's asking, do you think the AU joining the G20 will then make the AU be further exposed to its lack of internal review mechanisms?
Thank you. I know my colleagues will probably be happy to talk about internal review mechanism, and that's what they do best. But I think we should not try to exaggerate the disunity people keep talking about. There's every possibility to exaggerate African are disunited, they are not united. And we have to take note, and I'm sure people in this room, I want to force them to agree with me. We have to be mindful that when it comes to issues that are not directly related to African interests, people might want to take divergent view, which is accepted across the globe. But when you are talking about issues on climate change, for instance, there's no disunity in Africa. Issues on peace and security in the Sahel, I'm not saying that strong disunity. Issues against colonialism, I've not seen disunity. Issues against slavery, I've not seen disunity. So I am particularly sure that across Africa, from the north to the south, from the east to the west, there are poverty. Millions of people are living below $1 per day. There is an agreement that such issues should be tackled in Africa. There should be economic development. There should be peace and security. There should be infrastructural development across Africa. There should be good healthcare facility, good education. Those are things that across Africa we are united. But maybe I will allow my colleagues to respond to the other one. Thanks.
The last part, I'm so sorry, I was.
So the question basically is, will the AU joining the G20 expose the AU's lack of, so to speak, yes, unity and lack of internal review mechanisms?
So you mean that EPRM? Yeah, this is best.
If I get what the person might be asking, is trying to say there's disunity across board. And he's saying by the AU joining the G20, would Africa not expose this disunity further? And what would be the place of internal review mechanism, which will be carried out across board? I don't know how that two is linked, and that's why I stylishly push it to you so that we escape the bullet.
No, I think we have to also be realistic that the African Union, we have 8 organizations, and usually the most supreme level of decision making or even contribution to decision making is usually at the ministers of foreign affairs, the executive council, and the assembly. If there is any trial from EPRM, we are trying, of course, to have through our national structures and our continental consultations, this united voice to even reflect to the world about the concerns about good governance, concerns about Agenda 2063. But I think EPRM will also need the engagement of the other EU organs to establish such a position and then transmit it to the other world. Having said that, we have been also having our autonomous proximity, especially when it comes to all the non-state actors, even, and of course, member states, development agencies like ABC Brazil, ABC Colombia, where we signed also MOU for partnership to also dismantle and to share Africa's priorities within Agenda 2063 and SDGs. So I think we need to also work. We can work on different pillars or levels when it comes to sharing African priorities. But of course, we need to do this in full coordination with the African Commission and the EU Assembly. Thank you.
Thank you. So we're cautious of time, but the last question has to be asked, and it's the same for all the panelists. And that is, the African Union, once it joins the G20, will be the other continental body that's part of the G20, just like the European Union. So the question is, how or what lessons can the AU learn from the EU's engagement with the G20? We'll start with Dr. Mayaki, followed by Dr. Malansha, followed by Dr. Kinola, Elizabeth, and Sarah.
Okay. No. Thank you very much. Just 2 words on the issue of disunity, and I would like to agree with what the professor said. We had a much more united front within Africa regarding COVID than the European Union. Our health ministers gathered just after the beginning of the epidemic, and they had a strong position with a strong CDC, and they implemented an agreed upon strategy, which was not the case of the European Union, amidst the fact that the European Union is supranational and the African Union as an entity is intergovernmental. So I think disunity, we have been challenged by issues that have shown that we could have a united front. The same thing happened with Agenda 2063, which was defined before the SDGs and as a common African position in order to negotiate the SDGs. So sometimes the European Union has things to learn from us. Now, regarding the European Union, just in our last engagements with the European Union, I think what was quite remarkable is the frankness of both parties regarding their priorities and their interests. And I remember quite well the last summit in Brussels, where we were very clear on what commitments should look like and implementation of commitments should look like regarding migration issues, regarding climate finance, etc. And we have also been very clear regarding the global gateway, which was the critical instrument the European Union put in order to, have a response to the Silk Road project of China. So, but the global gateway after the Ukraine war was reduced by more than 40% in terms of commitments, and we understood it, but we drew lessons from it. And the lessons that we drew is that our engagement with the EU needed to be reframed in a much more global context than just an interaction between the European Union and the African Union. 2 examples now. regarding what we can learn from the EU. We know, for example, and it's a fact, I mean, everybody knows it, all European Union ambassadors in New York were permanent representatives. They meet regularly in order to have common positions during the UN debates. The African permanent representative do it more and more. This is a signal that we have been not copying and pasting, but learning from how the European Union is acting on the global scene. The other point I would like to make is that with the implementation of a continental free trade agreement, one of the main preoccupations with the European Union, when you talk in the corridors, not in the plenaries, is that will Africa be in the next 30 years another type of China, which would have a strong competition with Europe, and how Europe should support the continental free trade agreement, continental free trade area implementation, if Africa is supposed to be like a China in 30 years. This is a political issue that our leaders are quite knowledgeable of, but they need more knowledge and expertise from think tanks like SAIA and all the other knowledge centers. We need to project ourselves beyond the European Union and in front of an aging continent. We have strong comparative advantages, but we should put on the table in terms of negotiations. Elizabeth was referring to the important fact that within the G20 context, we build coalitions. Well, coalitions will be built in order to push interest. And I think this is a point where when we look in terms of coalitions, we should be extremely firm regarding our interest in the long term. Our fundamental priority today, in order to break with the obstacle of fragmentation, is to have a stronger economic integration, and the CFTA will be the instrument. So whatever we do, we'll need to take that into account so that we position Africa as a critical actor on the global scene. Let me stop here and thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Mayaki. Next, Dr. Malancha.
Thank you. I think I would like to share my views in a way that we should not, I mean, the EU will have a different path in G20. It will be very different from the EU, because the EU is one of the most integrated regions of the world, and it's also representative of a very tiny proportion of the world's population, which is very highly developed. And the EU's interests are not generally, I mean, they are not always in line with the larger interests of the developing world or larger populations. So EU needs to find, and the EU has been very successful in putting its agreed language on the G20 agenda. To be able to do that, the EU needs to have its interests very clearly defined and be able to put that across very well. So I think always drawing examples or trying to draw examples from the EU may not really work, because the challenges here are very different. The populations that EU represents and EU represents would be very different. So it would require a lot of new thinking, in my opinion.
Thank you very much.
Firstly, maybe I should start by saying this. The one thing I think the AU should try to do is to create this institutional memory. I know, unlike the EU, where you have relatively the same people, meeting over 10 years, 5 years, but because of the rotational system within the EU, that might be difficult. So the AU has to devise a way to make sure that the people representing them at G2 are people or experts that will stay for a long time. Then secondly, the AU must clearly define its objectives. They must identify the key issues they are pushing within the G20, because the European Union, they don't joke with the agenda they have. They have a way of mobilizing their resources to make sure that they achieve what they want at the global level. So the AU should also try to do that as much as they can. The EU ability to also balance national interests with a unified front is something the AU should also learn from the EU, because that's positive. Despite the little difference in external behaviors of member states, they are able to come together as a front and push for the same agenda at that level. Then maybe they should be able to adopt a coordinated economic strategy, because you can't go to the G20 and you get there being confused and you don't know what you want. I think the AU should try and do that. And lastly, for the AU to be a formidable voice and a force within the AU, it is important that they do. I think one of my colleagues said that they do that. They should see themselves as a problem solver within G20, not just for them to listen to decisions and say, yes, we support, no. They should be trying to push forth several agendas, because many of the global challenges affects Africa directly. So they should be in the forefront, and they should also try and even outwit the EU, not just copy the EU. Thank you.
So it's clearly not business as usual, and I think that has to sort of be forcefully made. And I think there is an opportunity here. We have the African Continental Free Trade Area, which is building incrementally, and I think we really need to push and we need to accelerate that, because I think the point that Dr. Mayake ended on in terms of we need stronger economic integration, I think both the ACFTA as well as potentially the AU's membership of the G20 can create sort of momentum for driving both processes in terms of also from a financial regulatory perspective on the continent, also greater coherence, greater standardization, etc. And I think the point that's been made today about needing to think about the next stage of reforms in the AU, I think is very important. If we're really going to be a significant player, we can't, as a continent, we have to move beyond the lowest common denominator in terms of defining common positions and driving specific policy recommendations.
Thank you very much. Now we'll open the floor to the participants physically to ask any questions they might have, and I will pass the mic around. Does anyone have any questions? No, I don't have questions.
Okay. Thank you very much for putting this important event together. I think it's timely, and I think it's well received. So my question is this. how can the African Union leverage on South Africa's experience as a member of the G20? Because obviously South Africa, it's a state member, and now we have an international organization trying to join the G20. So how can African Union leverage on South Africa's experience? And then Professor, I guess I've elevated you. Professor Sidiropoulos talked about the convergence of conflicts, convergence of interest and conflicts of interest amongst member states within the G20. So my question is this: how can we manage the potential conflict of interest between South Africa and the African Union? And also, how can we manage the potential conflicts of interest between the key members, the powerful members of the African Union and the small states? Thank you.
So the first one was around how can South Africa support or be, yeah. So I mean, I think even sort of in the immediately after 2008, I think there was South Africa worked together with. There was a committee of 10 that brought together central bank governors, finance ministers from the regions, and and some of the big banks. Central banks, including the regional banks, and there are certainly ways in which, provided there is an institutional framework that the AU sort of sets up, and here South Africa could also be of help. That the two can work together. So I mean, I do see that as an important element, and certainly something that I think I would imagine South Africa would be really keen to drive. The second one, I mean, the conflict of interest. I think even within the the EU sits on the G20 as well, and you don't always have on particular issues you may not necessarily always have coherence with its members, or members may take different approaches. Certainly, the EU on particular issues like trade has the competence. The member states don't negotiate on trade. It's the EU Commission, which is not the same in the case of the AU. But certainly those have to be, there will be conflicts of interest, no doubt, and they have to be identified. They have to be managed carefully. And at the end of the day, countries are there representing their interests. And there may well be differences on some points, and one manages and has to manage those, and within that grouping, because within the grouping there are many perspectives anyway, regardless of whether you're from the continent or not. And I think one of the interesting dynamics will be to see how the big countries within the African Union who are not members of the G20 sort of provide support, engage, or feel that, well, they should have been on there rather than the AU. They would have done a better job. And that's all part of this process. There is the hardcore need for expertise, institutional mechanisms, etc. And then there are some of the soft skills and soft negotiation that needs to go into this to build a buy-in as much from outside, from the G20, as also from AU member states.
Before we continue with the questions, Sarah Hamuda has to leave, and thank you very much for being part of this discussion. We wish you the best of luck. We'll be referring to you as Dr. Sarah very soon.
It's not yet, and thank you. And just to also add to what Elizabeth is saying about how to leverage on South Africa's position. Not very far from today, just 2 weeks ago, we organized a very thorough meeting as AU organs with DERCO in order to share our concerns about Agenda 2063 and all these reforms and the necessity to have this African position. And indeed, there's currently a conversation to have South Africa speaking not on behalf of the continent, but at least to have a coordinated position, at least during ONGA, about the priorities of Agenda 2063. And actually, they echoed the same, or maybe advice from Elizabeth, that other big AU member states, major contributors to the EU budget as well, to agree on this position together with South Africa. So we are in the process, but it's not easy, and it's a big continent with many member states. So we need to also, if we need to go far and we go together, we have to be a bit slow. Thank you very much. Unfortunately, I have to leave for another meeting, but I wish you all the best for the rest of the debate.
Thank you. We only have time for 2 more questions, just 2. And we are sorry for taking up much of your time, people who are online and people who are here physically with us, but is there anyone else with a question?
Yeah. Hi, good afternoon, everyone. I just wanted to ask, Elizabeth alluded to earlier that the G20 is filled with competing blocks, so your North-South bloc. So my question would be, how do we ensure that the geopolitical rivalries that we see today don't filter into that bloc, and ensure that the G20, or the soon-to-be G21, core focus is on the SDGs? Thank you very much.
So, I mean, I think the idea behind the G20 initially was that it was important to bring countries from the developing world as well as from the developed world together, because, you know, the developing countries were growing in economic importance, and therefore it was no longer the G7 or the G8 as it was then in a position to sort of make the calls on managing global systemic risks. I think we have seen a sort of growing divisions, and certainly last year during the Indonesian presidency, I mean, with the exception of the communique, you know, there were a lot of chairs' notes and chairs' summaries, because there were divisions on how to articulate and to mention and to reference the war in Ukraine. I think the Indonesians worked really hard, arguing that, you know, this is a space that should be focused on global economic governance, on development, and so on, and that, you know, we need to really not also, you know, end up having this space paralyzed. And I think the Indian presidency has been very much of the same view. And I mean, I was in India recently and had a number of interviews with policy officials and others, and the point was again made that it was important for the G20 to focus on what the G20 was about. Invariably, you know, everything's about politics, and it becomes very difficult. But I think there's been a concerted effort, both in the last year, Indonesia and in India, to try to retain that space for one where all the important systemically important countries can actually come together on some decisions to move some of these processes forward. You know, it's never easy, and depending on how long the war drags on, it can become more difficult. But I think there is certainly a concerted effort to try to build bridges in that forum rather than to see it sort of become paralyzed.
Okay, thank you very much for your questions and for your comments. I'm just looking around to see if there's anyone else who has a question. Why going once, twice, thrice? I've rushed it here. Thank you very much to our panelists and for the interesting questions and for the interesting discussions that we've had. Thank you very much for joining us, and please do keep the discussion ongoing online on our social media handles. For Development Reimagined, it is Dev Reimagined, and for SIRE, it is SIRE_info. We've learned a lot today, such as Africa, in short, must be bold. Africa must say what it wants. It must say what it needs, and it must be very clear with its priorities. And that youth academic institutions and think tanks, and at the risk of sounding as though I am advertising where I work for consultancies such as Development Reimagined, we must be consulted for the continent to have brilliant and bigger and better ideas. Thank you very much. Thank you for joining. Thank you for all the panelists, and thank you very much for taking your time to be here with us.
Thank you. Thank you very much. It was a pleasure. Thank you.
Good. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.